Let me just resume from where we were yesterday. Let me just remind you where we had stopped yesterday. Remember we said that there was a particular property of field theory correlators which works in states in almost any field theory as long as it's asymptotically free and as long as the state under consideration doesn't have infinite energy density. And that was that you look at and this correlator turns out to be proportional to So this correlator turns out to be this, and this was the result that was a very general result. Now the question that we have and the objective was to say that this is a result that holds everywhere. It holds outside the horizon and it holds inside the horizon. It holds in any region of space-time that's relatively smooth unless it has infinite curvature. There's something very bad happening. This is a result which didn't assume too much. And therefore, in any region of space-time which is reasonably smooth, we believe this result should hold. In particular, if you look at the horizon, the classical solution tells us that it is reasonably smooth. And when we are doing quantum field theory about a curved background, we trust the classical solution to leading order, and then we try to find correlators about the classical solution. And therefore, we believe that this correlator is true across the across the horizon as well. If you take U1 and U2 to be on opposite sides of the horizon. And the question that we had, that we were asking at the end of yesterday's lecture, is what does this tell us about the entanglement of modes across the horizon? Right? So we had mode expansions, which went like as follows. And there's an e to the ikx. It could also be, by the way, you could also be in the sphere. So you could write a spherical harmonic for this part. Yeah. This is the expansion outside. Okay, so I'm writing outside here. This is the outside expansion. And there's an inside expansion, which is inside the horizon, which looks very similar. These expansions we said yesterday, and the basic point is, what is it we want to do? The objective is, so do you understand these expansions? These are just the expansions that come from solving the wave equation in the near horizon background. So remember I said that the wave equation in the near horizon background has a property that it looks like d by dt squared minus d by dr star squared, okay, is equal to 0, where r star is the tortoise coordinate. Therefore, the solutions of the wave equation look like e to the I omega t minus r star and e to the I omega t plus r star. Okay, but e to the t minus r star is u and e to the t plus r star is v. That's where you get this u to the I omega and v to the I omega. Okay. It's very much like what happened in the Rindler case, where you solved some wave equation in Rindler coordinates, and when you wrote that in Minkowski coordinates, it had this form where it looked like u to the I omega. Rather than looking like e to the I omega into x minus t, it looks like x minus t to the I omega. Okay. So this is the solution for the wave equation. It just comes from solving the wave equation. The other important fact is the relative sign here. So the sign here is u to the minus I beta omega, here is u to the plus I beta omega. And the reason for that is that the role of the time-like coordinate inside the region 2 is played by r star. Okay, so the radial direction becomes the time-like coordinate in region 2. And therefore, whether something is an annihilation or a creation operator depends on whether it has positive or negative frequency with respect to r star, right? And therefore, because u has a form which is t minus r star, what multiplies u to the minus I omega is the annihilation operator outside the horizon, and what multiplies u to the plus I omega is the annihilation operator inside the horizon. Okay, so these were the expansions that we had, and this expansion, this A is the same as this A, and the reason for that is that the horizon, so this is, when I say inside, what I mean is that, remember you have this partial black hole, you have a horizon, and when I mean out, this is out and this is in. So this is in the, inside the forward region. And across that region, this V coordinate is continuous, and therefore you expect that this A is the same as this A, whereas the U coordinate goes to 0, and so you need new modes on the other side. Is this clear? Were there any questions about this?
So yesterday also you missed the 1 by root omega. Is that a thing or?
Oh, here? Oh no, that's not deliberate. Okay. Yeah, the 1 by root omega is the 1 by root omega, as all of you know, comes about. It depends on whether you normalize the annihilation operators with A dagger is 1 or A dagger is square root of omega. In this normalization, it looks like 1. I should say, by the way, there are also factors of 2 pi to some power that I'm missing here, if you want to be careful about the normalization. So if you really want to be careful about the normalization, there are some factors of, in the integrals you write over omega and k, you have to put in some factors of 2 pi to some power, which you should figure out. Okay, so in all of these notes, you should realize that we are working in units where 2 pi is equal to 1. So for the important results, that's not the case. When I write the temperature is 8 pi n, it is 8 pi n. But for expansions like this, there's a ddk and a d omega, and I'm not keeping track of factors of 2 pi. Okay, there's absolutely no point in trying to keep track of factors of 2 pi. And they just you can figure them out easily. Okay, are there any other questions about this expansion? Okay, good. So now the thing is that you want to use this expansion, right, to get this correlation function. And how does that happen? So you see, what you do is you take these phi's and you put them inside a correlation function. Right? Now, the moment you differentiate with respect to u, you do a du1 and a du2. It means you can forget about these v terms. Right? These v terms are not important. So what's important are the u terms. So now, what happens to the u terms? You see, if you look at this now, I think in our discussion yesterday, we took u2 to be outside the horizon and u1 to be inside. Right. So you see, what is this? This is integral d omega prime dk prime into the product of these things, right? And then let me put a into a dw into minus u2 plus a bw dagger minus I beta omega by phi plus b tilde omega into u1 plus a b tilde omega dagger into a u1 to the minus I beta omega prime phi. Okay. E3 I x I x1, x2. Is everyone happy with this? I haven't done anything except for just substitute these two lines into this correlator. Okay? That's all I've done. Is everyone happy with this? You have to copy it down. If you have these expansions, all I've done is I've killed this term, I've differentiated twice, that pulls down my beta by 2 pi. Okay? So that gives me this. Plus it pulls down the u1 and the u2. Right? Because you differentiate to pull down the u1 and the u2. Okay? And that's it. Right? And then you just substitute. So there's nothing else. Okay? So there's nothing complicated here in what I've done. Okay. Now I'm going to claim that if you set the following correlation function, so I'm going to erase this part, or maybe I'll actually just do it in that way. Let's see. If you use b omega k, b omega tilde omega prime k prime is equal to e to the minus beta omega by 2, 1 minus e to the minus beta omega into delta of k plus k prime. If you use this 2-point correlation function and all others 0, okay, all other correlators 0, then you will get this result using that expansion. Okay. So all other correlators, there are many correlators here. You see there's a b tilde, there's a b tilde dagger, there's a b dagger b tilde. This is non-zero, and of course its summation conjugate is non-zero. Okay, so when I say all others, this is of course equal to its summation conjugate. So you can conjugate it.
There's a delta form. One more.
There's a what?
One more delta.
Oh yeah, one more delta. Omega prime, and this is equal to one more, which is b omega k dagger, b tilde omega k dagger, and dagger. Okay, so this is equal, and all others are 0. So in particular, the cross correlators are 0. If you look at b dagger, b tilde dagger is that 0. B into b. When I say all others, actually there are only two others. B tilde dagger and b dagger b tilde is 0. Let me not write all others. Let me say which ones are 0. B tilde dagger is equal to b dagger b tilde is equal to 0. Okay? So now I think I've made all 4 correlators precise. And the statement is, if you use these correlation functions, then you will find that when you take this and you just evaluate this, you will get this answer. Okay? That tells you that if the 2-point correlation functions in position space have this form, then the 2-point correlation functions in momentum space have to have this form. Okay, how do you prove this? You see, you take these expansions and you just rewrite the whole thing. The first thing is, let's see if the alpha locality comes. The alpha locality you will see comes immediately. It comes immediately because you have it e to the I k dot x1 and e to the I k prime dot x2, right? And you immediately set k prime is equal to minus k. Okay, so what do you get? You get an integral, the integral of dk and dk prime, obviously this gives you an e to the I k into x1 minus x2. And so you immediately get the delta of x1 minus x2. Okay. So this term comes automatically. Now we have to see this term. Okay. So let me just do it on the board. See this just happens. I'll just write this. And what you get left with here? What you get left with here? There's an omega. Sorry, there's a 1 by omega here, which is actually. There's d omega prime, there's 1 by omega which I forgot to copy. Is there? And let me just tell you what you get here. What you get here is what you get here is b omega k okay, I'm going to write something slightly precise just for pedagogical use. So I'm going to write a b omega tilde dagger. I'm going to suppress the k indices because I already put a delta to x1. Okay, so b omega dagger into U1 by U2 to the I beta omega by 2 pi. Okay. This is an imprecise coordinate. Okay, there's nothing like b into b tilde omega. That's because you really should put those delta functions. I'm just writing it here for pedagogical clarity. Okay, and plus b omega dagger b tilde omega dagger into term that looks like minus u2 minus u2 by u1 to the I beta omega over 2 pi. Is this clear? Is this result clear? All I did is I took the previous expansion, okay, I got rid of these cross terms because the cross terms are 0. Then I implemented this delta function. That gave me this delta function in position space. Then I implemented the omega minus omega prime delta function. Okay, that omega minus omega prime delta function forces the coefficient of u1 and u2 to be the same but with an important minus sign. That's because remember this u comes with a minus beta omega and this u comes with a plus beta omega, right? So if omega is equal to omega prime, you get something that looks like u1 by minus u2 to the I beta omega. Okay, and then you get a minus u2 by u1 from the daggers to the I beta omega. Okay, is this clear? Right? So far, I'm not doing anything complicated. So don't get scared. You can all follow this. All I'm doing is I've taken the mode expansions, I've substituted that form, and I have got this. Right? So is there any confusion here? Okay. Now I'm going to substitute the detailed form as well. I'll put in my e to the minus beta omega. So then what happens? So then I get this. And I get this. Right? Okay. Now stare at this. What is the range if there is no omega prime also? Because they are full delta omega. Now what is the range of this integral? Where does omega range from? Very good. 0 to infinity. But stare at this term. Okay? This term has the property that you can write it as 1 by e to the beta omega by 2 minus e to the minus beta omega by 2. So this term is odd in omega. This term is also odd in omega. Right? So this term, including the omega there, is actually even in omega. Right? This is some u1 by u2 to the I beta omega. This is the same thing u1 by minus u2 to the minus I beta omega. Right? You see that? So I can write this whole thing actually as an integral from minus infinity to infinity and forget about that term as well. So now it has become an integral from minus infinity to infinity of this term. Right? Okay. So now what do we do? How do you do integrals from minus infinity to infinity? You complete the contour and you pick up the poles. Right? So you can do that here. So, depending on whether u1 is, so by the way, both u1 and minus u2 are positive numbers, okay? u1 is a positive number because it's inside the horizon and minus u2 is also a positive number, so both of them are positive numbers. Depending on whether minus u2 is greater than minus u1 or not, right, you can complete the contour. Okay? So, if mod of u2 is greater than mod of u1, okay, should I complete the contour in the upper half plane or the lower half plane? Okay, so if mod of u2 is greater than mod of u1, right, I have an integral over omega. You see that then this number is smaller than 1, the way I have written it right now. I could have written it as u2 by u1, but the way I have written it is if mod of u2 is greater than u1, then this number is something which is smaller than 1, right? So you want a lot of highly positive powers to come about. So you want to take omega to be negative. Whereas if this number is larger than 1, so that if u1 is larger than u2, then you want to take omega to the upper half plane because then this gives you something which is negative, right? Okay. either way, whether you complete it for the upper half plane or the lower half plane, where are the poles of this function? That's right, exactly. So the poles of this guy are at e to the beta omega. Sorry. One second. I've been. Guys, you should catch this. Okay, there's one more mistake here. Can some of you catch it? You haven't been following my algebra.
The omega integral.
Huh?
The omega integral.
Yeah. There's one more mistake. It's a trivial mistake, but it's actually an important mistake. Okay, sorry. Remember we had these two derivatives, right? The two derivatives pulled down not only factors of beta but also factors of omega. So there's a 1 over omega, but there's also an omega square that we haven't been writing. So we should have been writing here. There's a 1 over omega that comes from the measure factor, okay? And there's also an omega square because we differentiated twice. So it's actually plus omega. Everything we said is still true. It's still an even integral, but with one difference, there is no pole at 0. Okay. Otherwise, this integral would have had a pole at 0. So you can see. Actually, someone asked a question yesterday about why they have to differentiate. This is why we have to differentiate. Otherwise, you get something that's ill-defined. There's no pole at 0. Okay. So anyway, everything we said is still true. Now, where are the poles? The poles are at e to the where are the poles? E to the minus beta omega is equal to 1, and that involves what for omega? Exactly. Omega is twice I and pi, right? So if you do this, you see what you get. Once you complete this integral, you find that this whole answer, all this integral, becomes so there's this beta squared by 4 pi squared u1 u2 into so when you pick up when you pick up the poles, you get two things. There's an omega up front, right, which gives you a factor of the value of omega itself, which is 2 pi in, right? So there's a 2 pi in that you get, and then you have to divide by, when you pick up the residues, you have to divide by some 2 pi I. So when you work out those factors, you find that you get into a minus 1 over beta into a sum of n u1 by minus u2 to the power n into minus 1 to the power n. Okay. So let me just explain where all of these terms come from. You see, the poles are at e to the minus beta omega is equal to 1, okay, or omega is equal to 2 pi ni. Okay? Okay, so omega is equal to 2 pi ni by beta. Okay? When you pick up the residue, you have to take the residue and you have to divide by 2 pi I. Okay? So when you divide by 2 pi I, you're left with a factor of n by beta. Right? There's a minus sign which I think comes from the orientation, some overall minus sign which comes from the orientation. And then you have to look at the residue at the pole. So the residue at the pole involves first of all the omega and also e to the minus beta omega by 2. What's e to the minus beta omega by 2 at omega is equal to 2 pi n pi? It's minus 1 to the n, that's this term. Right? So you're left with this sum. Okay, what is this sum? And I'm being sloppy, I'm forgetting everything except for the important factors, that delta 2, which I erased up here. So what is this sum of nx to the n? Right, so what is sum of nx to the n? Sum of nx to the n? What is this sum? Do you know how to do this sum?
1 by 1 by minus 1 by 1 minus x squared, plus 1 by 1.
Exactly. So it's 1 by 1 minus x squared, right? And so it's just 1 by 1 minus x squared. And if you do that, you see you get a 1 by 1 minus u1 by u2 squared, right? And that, so this is equal to u1 by u2, 1 minus u1 by Actually, there's a minus 1, so it becomes a 1. It would have been a 1 plus u1 by u2 because u1 by minus u2, but there's a minus 1 to the end, so it becomes a 1 minus u1 by u2 to the square into these factors, beta squared delta 2x1 minus x2 squared. Okay, then you get u2 minus u1 squared, and you get a u1, u2 in the numerator. And you pull out this u2 squared, right? So this just becomes 1, 1. Right? Okay. So now we'll go back to our units where 2 is equal to 1. And I'll forget all of these constants. I don't need any of them anymore. And that's the full answer. Okay? So we found the answer that we wanted. Did everyone follow this? It's not hard, it's just doing contour integrals. It's just taking, a contour integral of e to the minus beta omega, taking the expansion. So let me just tell you what we did. If you didn't follow the algebra, you can reproduce the algebra. It's also in the notes, but it's easy to reproduce the algebra. If you want to see the algebra and all the factors correct and all the 2 pi's and so on good, look at that paper I told you yesterday. All the 2 pi's are not correct in the notes, but if you want to see all the factors correct, look at the paper. But apart from that, what we did was very simple. We had an expansion. We just substituted the expansion into this correlator, right? We had an ansatz for what the B tilde correlators were. We substituted that ansatz also. Once you have given me the 2-point correlator of the B's and B tildes, then I just have to, do an integral over omega and k. Doing the integral over k gives you the alpha locality, right? And then doing the integral over omega, you can do by a clever trick by doing some contour integral and picking up the poles at e to the 2 pi, at e to the minus beta omega is equal to 1. And when you pick up those poles, you get a geometric series. When you sum it, you get exactly the answer that you want. Okay?
The ansatz was anticipating the result.
The ansatz was anticipating the result, yes. But that's okay. Fourier transforms are unique. If you ask me what is the Fourier transform of f of x, what's the inverse Fourier transform of f of x, if I can find a function so that, it's Fourier transform f of x, that's good. So, what I've done here, by the way, is just Fourier transform this position space correlator into momentum space. It's true, I use an ansatz, but that's because doing the inverse Fourier transform would have been harder. This is a contour integral. But in the end, Fourier transforms are unique. So, if I can do a Fourier transform by guess, that's fine. Of course, I knew the answer, that's why I guessed it.
How do you know that? I mean, how did you guess it?
Well,
How did you know it?
You guess it because you know what the result of Hawking radiation is.
Okay.
So, you know the correct result. You can check if it's the correct result. But, in the end, if you're doing a Fourier transform, you can't ask how did you get the answer. You can check if you have the right answer. That's a fair question. How did you get the answer is okay. You got the answer. Okay. Anyway, but you can check that this is the right answer.
You can put some answers for B omega k and B tilde dagger omega prime k prime.
So that is 0.
So that is 0 you have taken.
Yes.
But you can take it reverse, like you can take it 0.
Okay, it won't work out then. You should try.
That is what you are saying, probably that it is unique.
Yeah, so it won't work out. You should try. I mean, you can try doing that. You won't get the right answer. You see, you won't get the right answer. Okay, you can check. You can persuade yourself you won't get the right answer. You see, the B's and B daggers are giving you things which look like U1 into U2, not U1 by U2. So you won't get anything that will look like the right answer. But you're welcome to try. I mean, it's a Fourier transform in the end. If I got the right answer, it has to be right answer. There's no point of saying it could have been something else. It couldn't have been. It can only be something else if it integrates to 0, which, there's no such thing which has Fourier transform, which is 0 everywhere. Okay, so is this clear? So therefore, we've proved something for the B tilde correlators. You can also, by the way, prove something for the other correlators, which are the B dagger correlators as well. Okay. So using the same techniques, but now taking U1 and U2 to be outside the horizon. Okay. You can prove the following results. I won't do this because it's exactly the same derivation. You can see, maybe you can try doing this in the tutorials. It's exactly the same derivation. B omega k dagger is equal to, so just follow what I'm writing carefully. Okay, is equal to e to the beta omega into B omega k dagger b omega k omega prime k prime is equal to b tilde omega k b tilde omega prime k prime is equal to e to the beta omega tilde dagger omega k is equal to 1 by 1 minus e to the minus beta. Okay, so all there are four correlators here. Okay, there's e to the beta b dagger, b tilde dagger, b dagger b, and b tilde. Sorry, what this is this correlate? B tilde. There's b tilde dagger, b tilde dagger, b tilde, b dagger b, and b dagger. Okay, so b dagger, b dagger b, b tilde dagger, and b tilde dagger, b tilde, and all of them are related. Okay. This answer is equal to 1 by 1 minus beta omega into this. What is this correlator? By this formula? What is this correlator?
1 by e to the power beta omega minus 1.
But, it's the same correlator but with e to the minus beta omega here. Okay. So this correlator is e to the minus beta omega into this number. That's why I wrote an e to the plus beta omega here. Okay. So just make sure you understand what I've written. This correlator is e to the minus beta omega into this. By the way, once I give you this correlator, do you know how to find this correlator if I hadn't written these halves? How would you have found it? Let's say I hadn't written this part. How would you have found what the, if I told you this b dagger correlator, how will you find the b dagger b correlator? There's a commutation relation you have, right? You know that b dagger is 1. You see, if I tell you what b dagger is, then b dagger b is that minus 1. So you know that. So you can, if I only need to tell you 1. And you can check in fact that if you put a beta minus beta omega, that's this minus 1. Okay, so you can check that this is the case. Okay, good. So this comes by using the same derivation but now taking the both points outside the horizon or both points inside the horizon. It's the same derivation. But with both points outside or both points inside. The reason you don't need the e to the minus beta omega by 2 is because you don't want a minus 1 by n. Minus 1 to the n any longer. Okay. So the e to the minus beta omega by 2 instead of the e to the minus beta omega is giving us this factor of minus 1 to the n, which you don't need. Because you had a u1 in one case and a minus u2 in the other case.
What did you say about both points being outside and inside? What?
To derive these correlators, these four correlators, you have to take the same derivation, but take either both points outside the horizon or both points inside the horizon. To derive the b tilde correlator, you have to take both points inside the horizon. To derive the b correlator, you have to take both points outside the horizon.
But so while we're getting that distribution, that is somewhat troubling. Like when it is across the horizon, I understand that you get that sort of distribution. In this case, I would see
this distribution is telling you that this distribution is telling you that the modes outside, if there's some observer who's just living outside, who's just measuring the b dagger correlators, that observer sees a thermal distribution of the b modes. So what are these results telling you? These results are telling you the following. They're telling you the b modes are entangled with the b tilde modes. So modes outside and inside the horizon are entangled. If you just look at modes outside the horizon and look at a 2-point function of modes outside the horizon, that's a thermal 2-point function. This distribution is something you've seen. It's the Bose-Einstein distribution. So it's telling you that the distribution in modes is a thermal distribution. If you just look at the 2-point function outside, you see a thermal occupancy. If there's someone inside, that person inside sees something more complicated. We'll come to the person inside sees maybe tomorrow. But at least if you're a person outside, the physical interpretation is very clear. You're measuring the b dagger modes and you're seeing a thermal distribution.
From these relations, we will say that the inside observer also sees a thermal distribution.
Yeah, there's an issue about the energy. It's true, but let's discuss the inside observer in a minute. It's true that if you're an inside observer who's moving in some appropriate, let's discuss the inside observer in a minute. You see, not in a minute, actually tomorrow. Okay, we'll discuss the inside observer tomorrow. If you look at the outside observer, this is the reason there's a very clear interpretation of what energy means for the outside observer. Omega here for the inside observer doesn't mean energy. Right? So this is saying that the number of modes at a given energy omega is 1 by 1 minus beta omega. For the outside observer, omega is energy. Omega is the energy as mentioned as at infinity because it's the way the mode transforms under d by dt, which is clearly the energy for the outside observer.
So then there is no frame in which you can see a non-thermal spectrum for the B modes.
No, of course. What do you have for the B modes? The B modes, there's, when you specify the modes, you can't also talk of a frame.
Frame sub transfer. Okay.
The modes mean a frame. Which modes you're talking about, tell you what frame you're talking about. You can't say, you can't look at one modes in another frame. Modes come with a frame. Modes are the definition of frame. What modes are you using tells you what frame you're using. So the B modes, which are the modes which are used by a Schwarzschild observer, because those were the modes that look like e to the I omega into r star minus t, the r and t were, the Schwarzschild coordinates, have a thermal distribution. So this is the result. This is the most precise derivation, I think, of Hawking radiation. We haven't fudged anything, except for factors of 2 and 2 pi, but you don't need to fudge them. You can get them all right. You haven't fudged anything. We've been very clear about what the assumptions are. We've been very clear about what the result we get is. The result we get is that two-point functions have a thermal, have a Bose distribution. Okay, so now we can actually go on to discuss.
So there must be some approximation in this, right? Or is this an exact result?
At the statement of two-point functions, this is an exact result. The thing that's not true, we haven't taken care is issues of interactions and other such things. And we've always been working in the near horizon limit. Okay? So, strictly speaking, this result that we had was true in some, in some delta v goes to 0 kind of approximation. These expansions that we would use were all valid in the near horizon limit. If you start adding corrections, you will find that this two-point function has this form, plus corrections that are suppressed by the interaction, which is actually the typical energy, which tells you, which is suppressed basically by energy squared by m Planck squared. So the corrections that you get to this, you expect, are corrections that are suppressed by omega squared by m Planck squared, which are very small, which is the same as, that's also the typical scale of the curvature by the way the horizon is omega squared by m Planck squared. Okay, so you get corrections, and those are the corrections which you've ignored. Those are the corrections due to back reaction. Okay, so this leads us, by the way, now actually we've done everything. So now for the next, for the remaining part, we'll discuss the paradoxes that arise from this, which include also what this means for the infalling observer. Yeah.
So the corrections will hold even for the B tilde as well.
Yes,
there will be order.
Everything has these corrections.
Correct.
Omega squared by.
So the mixed, the density matrix in effect will be receiving very small,
Correct.
but does it have any effect on saying anything about the mixed state of the density?
Yes, give me a second. Yes. Good. So if you start from this, you immediately come up with a statement which is the crudest version of the information paradox. Okay. The crudest version of the information paradox says, and this is actually the version that people had first for a long time, is look at the B Dagger modes. Look at the B Dagger modes. They have a Bose-Einstein distribution. They have a thermal distribution. It must be the case that the density matrix that you get outside is thermal. Okay. So what have we done? What is the physical process? Physical process is that. So by the way, for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to try and say something which is very simple. So for those of you who got lost in the discussion of field theory correlators, please wake up, because now what I'll say is very simple, and I'd like everyone to get a sense to understand what I'm going to say for the next 45 minutes, because it's really very simple. Okay, so I'm going to say something very simple for the next 45 minutes, and I'd like everyone to understand it. So even if you got lost with field theory correlators, we're now not going to use anything except for some qualitative parts of those results. Okay. So what is the process that we now have? The process we have is take a black hole. Okay. Black hole evaporates, it sends out radiation. It sends out radiation in the B modes, right? These B modes are outgoing modes, and we've seen that the B modes tend to get thermally populated. Right? That's what we just proved a second ago. So, thermally populates B modes. Now, we have not so far considered the back reaction of the modes on the geometry, right? We've been doing quantum fields in curved spacetime. Okay, so in that you don't consider the back reaction of the fields on the geometry. But you could consider the back reaction of the fields on the geometry. So if the black hole thermally populates the B modes, it must be that the black hole is losing energy. Right? Because if energy is going out into these B modes, then the black hole must be losing energy. Right? Therefore, if you do this, and you do this, plus you consider back reaction. There are two parts to this argument, okay? This is a precise part, which is that it thermally populates B modes. We just proved this part, okay? We spent a lot of time trying to prove that the black hole thermally populates the B modes. This part is imprecise, but you believe that it's true on very general principles. No one has actually added back reaction and made sure that what I'm saying right now holds. But you believe in very general principles, if it's populating some modes thermally, then by back reaction, the black hole will shrink. So you get... Okay. So the state that you claim you get is, small black hole plus a lot of B radiation. And this involved two parts. It involved first the fact that the black hole thermally populates the B radiation, which tells you this, you get this. Then it involved a part which said, if it's thermally populating the B modes by conservation of energy, the black hole must shrink, so you must get a small black hole. Okay? So this is something and as I said, the second part, there's one part which is very precise, and the second part which is not very precise, because you can't actually take into account back reaction the way we precisely calculated the effect on the B modes. Now, we have immediately a version of the information paradox, which goes as follows. Look at the B modes. Okay. The B modes are thermally populated. So it looks like, if you start with a black hole which is formed in a pure state, and you start with a black hole, or as I said some time back, you start with a library, you collapse it. By this argument, by all these arguments we've done so far, you get black body radiation in the B modes. Okay. Therefore, you've gone from pure state to mixed state. Okay, so you could say this is pure state. So you can make the black hole out of a pure state. You can take a lump of matter which is in a pure state. Just because it's a lump of matter doesn't mean it's in mixed state. You can take a wave function which shows that you have a pure state ball of dust. You collapse it to a black hole. You thermally populate the B modes. You do this back reaction. One part is precise, one part is imprecise. From these two arguments, you conclude the black hole shrinks. Then you've got a very small black hole and B radiation. I showed you some time back why it can't be that there's a lot of entanglement between these two, because this has very small mass. So it looks like really the final state you have, when the black hole has almost shrunk off to nothing, is only this thermal B radiation. Okay? And that looks like a thermal state. Okay. So the crudest part is, oh look, we have a paradox. How did this happen? We have a pure state, we got a black hole. The black hole evaporated, you got these B modes, the B modes are thermal, as we showed, and if they're thermal, that means we're in a thermal state, and oh my god, we have a paradox, and quantum mechanics breaks down, and we have such a serious problem. Okay, so that's the crudest version of the information paradox. And I want all of you to understand that this is not a paradox, okay? So let me just elaborate this a little more. You're all familiar, I think, with matrices. Right? So density matrices, and if you take a density matrix of a pure state, it satisfies rho square equal to rho for a pure state. This is the criteria of the density matrix is the density matrix of a pure state. Okay, this means that you can write rho as some psi for some state psi, right? Of course, you can write rho as a mixture. If it was AI into psi, then it would not satisfy rho square is equal to rho. Okay? But under any unitary evolution, if you look at u, rho u dagger squared, you get another u there. This also is u rho u dagger. So unitary evolution preserves purity. Oh my god, how did this happen? We went from a pure state to something which was not pure, and therefore, maybe gravity doesn't respect quantum mechanics or whatever, right? So this is what a lot of people said. It doesn't actually, yeah. Good, so that's good. So as you can see, everyone already knows the answer. So you shouldn't have thought, there shouldn't have been a paradox. Right? Because people should have realized that they did a calculation of some 2-point functions, and maybe some people did a calculation of higher point functions, and maybe some people even managed to compute in some situations, the omega by m Planck corrections that we discussed, maybe in some situations you can control them as well, and they found it was still thermal. But the fact is that the fact that you computed some correlation functions, okay, this is an important thing. The fact that you computed some correlation functions and you found them to be thermal does not mean that the final state is thermal. Okay, this is very important. Just because you compute some correlators, you find that those correlators look thermal, it does not mean that the final state is thermal. It does not mean that the density matrix that represents the state is thermal at all. As I said some time back, it's easy to find examples of density matrices that have the property. In fact, I will give you one right now. That for a large, this is what one may call a. Okay, I'll specify what E alpha is in a second. But which has the property that for some observable, this is e to the minus beta h A alpha plus e to the minus s by 2, where s is the entropy, which is very large for a black hole. Okay, so it's very easy to find examples of density matrices that have this property, but are pure. And I'm going to give you an example in a minute. Okay, and I'll specify what E alpha has to be also. E alpha is almost any observable. Okay? So almost any observable, and for almost any suitably complicated state in a suitably complicated statistical mechanics system, almost any suitably pure state looks like a thermal state. Okay? So people should never have thought actually that this was a paradox, unless they wanted to believe that for some reason gravity is special. You should not have thought that this was a paradox. In this form, okay, in the form in which we have found it right now, which is what a lot of people had for a long time, you should never have thought this was a paradox because of this fact. Okay? So let me give you an example. What is the kind of observable that A alpha has to be? A alpha, generally when you look at coarse-grained observables, which could be local observables, in a thermal system they could be the field observables, or they could be, basically almost anything that's measurable in a complicated enough statistical mechanics system, anything that thermalizes, and you know that in a system with interactions almost everything thermalizes, okay? Almost everything thermalizes, obeys what in statistical mechanics is called the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. Okay? And the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis is the following statement. Consider two eigenstates, energy eigenstates EI and EJ, okay? And consider this matrix element. This matrix element, the claim is, has to have this form. Okay, where this S is the entropy at EI plus EJ by 2, is the density of states at a given energy, at the mean energy of these two, like SI, S of EI plus EJ by 2, and the S is also divided by 2. Okay, so there's a 2 inside the bracket and 2 outside the bracket, and these are random phases. Okay, this is called the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. Eigenstate thermalization hypothesis, you can read papers by Srednicki. If you do a Google search for Srednicki and eigenstate thermalization, ETH stands for eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. You will find the description of these. There are some old papers from 94 and 95 and so on. But in any case, this is the statement of the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. Okay? And most observables do obey this eigenstate thermalization hypothesis in systems that thermalize. Not all observables in all systems, but most observables. Certainly we believe that if a black hole is an ordinary statistical mechanics system, or you look at any field theory and look at correlators of fields, they are good observables, and they do obey this eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. Okay? Now I'm going to give you an example of a system that has this property, okay? that obeys this. So let's take a state. I'm going to take a pure state, which is of this form. Okay, so beta is a number right now. I'm going to write here. Okay, this is a state. It's a pure state. Okay? It's a pure state that's a linear combination of all energy eigenstates in the system, but with some coefficients in front which look like e to the minus beta e by 2. As you've written it, it looks like a very special state, but in fact almost all states have this property. I'm just giving you one very simple example. Okay? Here's a state. To normalize it, you have to have z as beta. You see why? Because if you look at psi squared, you get the partition function in the state. See that? If you look at psi squared, you get just sum of e to the minus beta e. Right? Okay, now let's take an observable that satisfies that eigenstate thermalization hypothesis and compute this. Right? Okay. So what do you get? You get all sorts of cross terms. Right? So what you get is sum of e to the minus beta ei plus ej by 2 into e ei e alpha ej, and of course a 1 over z, right? If you're happy with this, I haven't done anything so far. Now I'm going to substitute for that from this eigenstate thermalization hypothesis into e to the minus, you see there's a delta function in the first term, so that just gives me some number. That gives me A alpha E is some function, okay. A alpha E is just some function of energy which tells me the diagonal elements are. I should have said, sorry. For those of you who, the key point here, should have emphasized, was this e to the minus s. Okay? So the key point here is that you have some diagonal terms. The diagonal terms are order 1. Okay? And you have some off-diagonal terms. There are only e to the s diagonal terms. You see the dimension of the Hilbert space around energy, the density of states is e to the s. So there are only, you should think of this as an e to the s plus e to the s matrix, morally. It's an infinite dimensional matrix, but the relevant terms are e to the s terms. In that e to the s terms, the diagonal terms are order 1. There are e to the 2s off diagonal terms. Those e to the 2s off diagonal terms are suppressed by e to the minus s by 2. This is important for making sure that a squared, for example, also behaves regularly. If both the diagonal and the off diagonal terms are all order 1, you'll find that a squared will not behave regularly. So this is a very generic property. If you take some matrix in a big system, do this in Mathematica, take a big matrix and just scramble it in some way. Make an arbitrary change of basis, some random change of basis, and look at the matrix elements of that matrix. You will find they obey the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. This is just a statement that from the point of view of a typical observable, which is not the energy, most energy eigenstates look like random states. They don't look like anything special. So if you just look at a typical observable, it has this property. So I want to say it's a very, very weak assumption. There's very little that goes into the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. You really expect it to hold in almost all settings. So anyway, if you now substitute that here, you find first of all the diagonal terms, and then you get the sum over the off-diagonal terms. Somehow the off-diagonal terms has a form that it looks like e to the minus s by 2. Then it's a somewhat ei ej. Looks like e to the minus beta ei plus ej by 2. And then it looks like this rij. Okay, so I just substituted. Right? Is everyone happy with this so far? Okay. Now,
for the left-hand equation, you're saying absolutely no, pretty much no restrictions on A alpha.
That's right. Pretty much no restrictions.
What happened with the second term?
The second term?
So the s into ei.
I put in e to the minus s. It's not s into s of ei plus ej by 2.
Oh.
Sorry. It's s of ei plus ej by 2. It's not s into. It's not e to the s squared, it's e to the minus s by 2. That's because the matrix's size e to the s. So it's s off, okay? So So now, if you look at the second term, you'll see that the second term has e to the 2s states. Okay, it has e to the 2s states, but these e to the 2s states only contribute at these e to the 2s states are all random states, right? So if you take a very large number of random states, n squared random states, and you add them up, what's the answer that you n squared random numbers and you add them, what's the answer you expect to get? Magnitude, what's the answer? Magnitude of the answer you expect to get. If you take n squared random phases and you add them up, what's the magnitude? And that's true, it's 0, but what's the square of the magnitude? What's the magnitude that you get? N, right? You get the square root n. So the magnitude of this term, now I just want to look at the magnitude of this term. The magnitude of the second term, you're right, the expectation value of the second term is 0. I want to look at the square root of the square of the expectation value. So the square root of the expectation value of the square. Okay, so that's the magnitude. So that the magnitude of the second term is roughly e to the minus s by 2, which is the e to the minus s by 2 we have up front, into it. You see, at a given, if beta is a given number, the only energies that tend to contribute to the sum, and this comes from the usual, fact that at a given beta, only some energies contribute. So this you've seen in statistical mechanics, right? If I fix the temperature, I also basically fix the energies. So you see that the only terms that tend to contribute are terms at a given energy. So there's some variation of the energy which is small, right? You've seen this, that if you fix the temperature, you fix the energy up to some small variations. Have all of you seen this? Have all of you seen this? That if you fix the temperature, you fix the energy up to small variations. Up to variations where delta E by E is 1 over root E. So this is the, if you haven't seen this, maybe we can discuss this in the tutorials. It's a most fundamental fact about thermodynamics, is that if you fix, the temperature of a heat bath, it's the thing that tells you that there's an equivalence of ensembles between the canonical and the microcanonical. Now, if you fix the temperature of some system, you also fix the total energy up to small fluctuations. So if you that's the statement that is. So that's a well statement. So in any case, there's some total energy that's fixed up to some fluctuations, which is e to the minus beta e. Then you get an e to the s. And e to the s comes from this n squared n estimate we made, right? Because this comes from, e to the 2s random term. Okay, then there's a 1 over z. Right? Okay, what is z? What is this e to the minus beta e plus s? No, e to the minus beta e plus s is not 0. E to the minus beta e plus s is e to the minus beta f. It's the free energy. The free energy is E minus Ts. So this combination is e to the minus s by 2, e to the minus beta f by z. Okay, what is this? E to the minus beta f by z.
1.
It's 1. So this is e to the minus s. S by definition is e to the minus beta f, right? The log of the partition function is the free energy. Okay, so this is 1. So this is e to the minus s by 2. So the second term is e to the minus s by 2. What about the first term? This term is just the thermal trace. This is just trace of e to the minus beta h of A alpha by z plus e to the minus s by 2. The first term is this, the second term is e to the minus s by 2. That's what we did, right? Order e to the minus s by 2. Sorry, this is all, if I'm not making clear, all these are estimates. So I'm just estimating the size. I'm not saying this term is exactly e to the minus s by 2 to 1. I'm estimating the size. The size of the second term is plus order e to the minus s by 2, where the exact number that you get, of course, depends on what phases you have and so on. Okay? But the fact is that in this state, the expectation value of some observable is trace of e to the minus beta h alpha by z plus an order e to the minus s by 2 term. And even though I gave you an example of a very special state, in fact, this result holds for generic states psi. Okay? The precise result is that if you take from a given band of energies a generic state, you can define generic also very precisely. It's defined by using what's called the Haar measure of the Hilbert space, which is the measure in the unitary group. If you take a generic state, then that generic state approximates the microcanonical ensemble up to exponential accuracy, and by the equivalence of ensembles, it also approximates the canonical ensemble up to 1/n accuracy. So the statement is that most states look thermal. I've given you one example, but most pure states look thermal for most observables, in suitably complicated systems. Not the vacuum, of course. People when they think of pure states, they tend to think of the vacuum, and the vacuum doesn't look thermal. But the vacuum is not a generic state. If you pick a state with high enough energies in any statistical mechanics system, a typical state, that state will look thermal. Okay, so sometimes our intuition about pure states tends to be colored by the fact that we are thinking of the vacuum, but the vacuum is a very special state. The moment you look at energies above some amount, at the point where you can start defining a temperature, then typical states look like thermal states as we have seen here. Okay. Therefore, the fact that, so what's the conclusion? And I'd like all of you to understand this. It's a very simple conclusion. So the conclusion is as follows. If some correlators behave thermally, this does not imply, okay, so everyone please get this message, very simple slogan, does not imply that the state is thermal. Okay. What did Hawking calculate? Hawking calculated some correlators. Right? From that, you cannot conclude that the state is thermal. So what's the slogan for the information paradox? First slogan is that Hawking's calculation is not precise enough So if you want to look at the crudest version of the information paradox, there's actually no paradox at the level of Hawking's calculation. Okay, so this is the message I'd like everyone to get, and the message follows from what we've said here so far. Okay? So we had a pretty precise derivation of we had a pretty precise understanding of what Hawking's calculation was. That's why I went through it in so much detail in so many ways. What Hawking's calculation really shows you is that 2-point functions of fields look thermal. Maybe you can improve the calculation and make it say that 4-point functions or 3, some leading order corrections also look thermal. That is far from proving that the state is thermal. Okay, so this doesn't imply that there's a paradox. This is message 1.
Around when did people realize this?
I don't know when people realize this. I mean, I think they should have known it forever, but some people still don't know it, which is why it's an important message to get. And in fact, many people still don't know it. So I would say that there are many people who are confused about this fact, but you should see it. It's a very simple fact. Okay, so people, yeah. So maybe it's still not true that everyone realizes this, but it's a fact. Okay. Let me say one more thing which you'll hear when you hear discussions of the information paradox, which is also something that I think many people don't realize. Sometimes they say, oh, Hawking's calculation is not precise enough to imply a paradox. So let me do a more precise calculation and then we will produce a paradox. Okay? That's also the wrong way to go. By the way, there is a paradox. I'm going to talk tomorrow about what the real paradoxes are. But there's one idea which is, oh, it's not precise enough, so let's correct it. Let's start adding these omega squared by Planck squared corrections, and then we'll have a paradox. We will make sure that the guys who say small corrections will fix it are wrong, and so let's compute the leading corrections, and then we will see a paradox. Okay? So that's one attitude. You can say Hawking's calculation is not precise enough. Let's do a more precise calculation of Hawking radiation to see if there's a paradox. Okay? So instead of computing 2-point functions, you compute 2-point functions, you compute the leading corrections and so on, and then maybe you can argue that there's a paradox. Okay, that's a futile hope, as I now want to show you, which is the second message all of you should get. Everything I'm saying right now, I think, will go under what one calls the old information paradox. Okay, so it's work that roughly is before 1985 or so, and actually even before 2009, and there isn't really a paradox that I'm now about to show you. So some people say, let's make Hawking's calculation precise. Some people say, let's do this. Now I want to emphasize to you that this is futile. Okay? It's futile to try and do this. It's also futile to try and, some people say, let's make it precise to check if there's a paradox. Some people say, let's make it precise to check that explicitly check that the state is pure. Okay? Either way, it's not something that's worth doing, I think, which I want to emphasize. Okay? So there are two attitudes you could take. You could say, let's make the calculation precise, and we will see the leading corrections, and we will see that the leading corrections make the state pure. Okay? There are some people who say that. Then there are some people who think we will see the leading corrections, and we will see the leading corrections make the state thermal, and therefore we really have a paradox. Either way, it's a futile hope. Okay?
This
And
calculation leaves no room for any corrections, right?
with Hawking's calculation, no, it does. You see, there is omega square and Planck square corrections, as I mentioned. So you could always try to correct the computation of coordinates.
With this ETH thing.
So the ETH thing is just telling you that a pure state can look like a thermal state up to accuracy e to the minus s by 2. So the e to the minus s by 2 is the important. It's the
That
state.
will be a very small number, not to our accuracy.
That's right. So it will be a very small number, and in fact, because you can never reach that number, you can never, by doing perturbation theory, and I'm going to show you, in fact, even in principle, by doing perturbation theory, you can never actually check that e to the minus s by 2, which is what you need to check to see if the state is pure or not. Okay? So to check this, you would need e to the minus s by 2 accuracy in computations, right? Okay. And now I want to show you that this is something which you cannot do, even in principle using perturbation theory, however powerful you are. Why is it that you can't do it? Okay. Here's the reason you can't do it. You see, if you wanted to compute, if you really wanted to do quantum gravity, and you really wanted to do field theory, in the presence of gravity, you wouldn't do quantum gravity the way we have been doing quantum gravity so far, right? Or quantum field theory so far, which is taking a fixed background and trying to quantize fields about that background. Instead, what you would do is you would consider the full path integral, right? Where this is now the action, S action. How do I write action instead of differentiate from entropy? I. Right? I. So e to the I. Okay, so it's e to the minus I, dg, which is the Euclidean action. So this is how you would try to compute the action. Compute the path integral, and then you could, try to compute from this path integral. You could try to compute, various properties. However, when you do perturbation theory, what is it you're doing? When you do perturbation theory, what you're doing is the following. In this, you're doing a sum over all metrics, right? So you should be summing over all metrics when you do quantum gravity. Why is it that we are permitted to do quantum gravity about a fixed metric background? What is the reason for that?
Planck is much smaller, much larger than the scales.
Okay, so
the corrections are very small.
corrections to what? You're summing over all metrics, so the corrections to what?
So
If I start with the full quantum gravity path integral, corrections to what?
It's like a saddle point approximation.
Right, exactly. It's a saddle point approximation. You see, looking at a fixed geometry is a saddle point approximation. What we say is we have a full action, which is a quantum gravity path integral. Then you do a saddle point. Okay, and then you get our world. Okay, which is the saddle point of this integral. Right? So if you wanted to do a full, understanding of the black hole, you would look at the full, quantum gravity path integral. There's a saddle point of that path integral which corresponds to the Schwarzschild black hole. Right? The saddle point of the path integral which corresponds to a Schwarzschild black hole corresponds to that metric. That saddle point is our world. Right? Now, when you do perturbation theory about that, you're doing a series expansion about the saddle point. Right? So, perturbation theory is a saddle point approximation. Okay. Perturbation theory is a saddle point approximation. What do we know about saddle point approximations? What is the one outstanding fact about saddle point approximations? Saddle point approximations are generally not convergent, okay, and they are generally asymptotic expansions. Are you all familiar with this fact? Maybe you're okay. So, for example, take Stirling's formula, which is n factorial, and you can try to expand it out in a saddle point. So and you can check, you get some corrections which n factorial looks like n to the n, e to the minus n into 1 minus 1 by 12 n plus other terms. But in fact, these expansions are generally not convergent. Why is it that saddle point approximations are not convergent? The saddle point approximations are in general not convergent because what is it that happens? It's a famous argument that was given by Dyson that had to do with why the saddle point approximation of quantum electrodynamics, for example, is not convergent. What he said was, he said that what you do is you take this path integral and you have some 1 over g squared term that's sitting in front. Now you have this 1 over g squared term and you expand it out in a perturbation series. The perturbation series looks like what? It looks like some, I should write, right? It looks like f of 0 plus g squared f of 1 plus, right? Okay, but this path integral has an outstanding property, which is if you change the sign of g squared, this system is totally unstable. If you change the sign of of alpha, not of the electron charge, but if you change the sign of the fine structure constant, okay, then you know that the world is physically unstable. But this expansion, which is a perturbative series expansion, is convergent. Nothing bad happens to this expansion. You get some minus signs, but nothing bad happens to this expansion. Okay, so these expansions are all you can see from this that this expansion is clearly only an asymptotic expansion. And you're missing terms of the kind of e to the minus 1 over g square. Okay? The other statement which you may have heard is that these saddle point approximations are good as long as you reach an accuracy, okay, which has to do with the next saddle in the saddle point approximation. So saddle point approximations can only give you an accuracy which has to do with the difference of the saddle point you're considering and the next closest saddle point. So in quantum electrodynamics, for example, you can never get an accuracy of more than e to the minus 137. You all understand? You can do as many loops as you like, but once you go beyond e to the minus 137, your expansion will start, your terms will start rising again. You can never get an accuracy beyond e to the minus 137 in quantum mechanics by doing perturbation theory. Therefore, if you start doing perturbation theory, there is in principle a limitation to how accurate you can get in perturbation theory. That in principle, thing is roughly has to do with the value of the Euclidean saddle point, which is the size of this e to the minus s by 2. Okay? So therefore, this computation, if you would need e to the minus s by 2 accuracy, and this is fundamentally a non-perturbative computation. Okay? Now there's something special about perturbation theory in gravity, which is not true in other theories. You see, in quantum electrodynamics, okay, field theory doesn't, perturbation theory doesn't converge. So, we do lattice simulations. We do something else. We put it on the computer. Maybe we don't have very powerful computers today, but in principle, you can put everything on a computer, and you can do an exact path integral. Right? There's something special about perturbation theory in gravity, which is that locality is a perturbative concept. Because locality itself has to do with the fact that you're in a saddle point. You have a certain metric which tells you what the relations between local correlators are. So non-perturbatively, you don't have any notion of locality either. So the whole derivation of Hawking radiation and any corrections that you might want to do with it, clearly, you'd run into deep trouble the moment you go into the non-perturbative regime, because you would lose a notion of locality. You would lose even the notion of what is inside the horizon and what is outside the horizon. When you talk about the horizon is a statement, is something that computes the difference, that demarcates two causally disconnected patches. But causally disconnected patches means causally disconnected in a given metric. If you start asking non-perturbative questions, clearly that's a meaningless question, because in a given metric means in a given saddle point. Okay? So there's there's something special about perturbation theory in gravity, which is that, so you lose notions of locality. And therefore, this is a futile computation. Maybe you would find some way to do it, but really there is no order in perturbation theory which would let you do it. And what is more, using perturbation theory and our usual intuition about locality, there is very little you could say about making Hawking's calculation precise enough to lead to a paradox. That's because it needs e to the minus s by 2 accuracy, and this accuracy is non-perturbative. You can't get it in any order in perturbation series that I just showed you. And non-perturbativeness leads you to lose the notion of locality, because, as I pointed out, locality has to do with saddle points. Okay? So, the two messages. One of them is Hawking's calculation is not precise enough to lead to a paradox. Yes, sir. Message number one. Message number two, it cannot be made precise enough to lead to a paradox. So if you see people who are trying to, compute or correct Hawking's computation to either make it pure or make a paradox, you should tell them that's a waste of time. That's not what we're doing. So Hawking's calculation is not precise enough, and this is not the right place to look at if you want to see a paradox. There is a paradox, which I'll explain, but it doesn't come by looking at Hawking's calculation or by computing corrections to Hawking's calculation. And this is an important statement which I think a lot of people in fact don't understand, but it's very simple as I'm saying, as I'm pointing out right now. So a lot of people do not appreciate this fact, but it's very simple and you should appreciate it. Okay, good. So, are there any questions about this part?
Just slightly before, suppose you start with a B theta correlator, which was not thermal. Like you are saying that my 1/over corrections are all, the
BB dagger, yeah.
BB dagger or BB tilde.
Right.
So you are summing over all the corrections that are there and you are writing an effective correlator. And you work upwards from there, looking at what will be the space-time correlator at that point. So you won't end up with the ultra-local event.
You won't end up with the
ultra-local
correlator. You probably will. I mean, if you take the right limit, you probably will still end up with the ultra-local behavior. It's a question of, good. The first thing you would correct would be the 1 by u1 minus u2 squared terms, which are the first things you would correct. That ultra-locality is something which, really has to do with the fact that you're taking a limit as delta v goes to 0. That ultra-locality probably is pretty robust, but you would correct, the 1 by u1 minus u2 squared. And of course, the moment you moved away from, delta v equal to 0, then you wouldn't have that ultra-locality. That ultra-locality has to do with, taking 2 points very close on the light cone. In that limit, you would, that's a pretty robust property. Let's see. Maybe if you tried, let's see. It's true, I think, that if you look at correlators which are so close to being on the light cone that they are almost, M Planck separated or L Planck separated, then maybe you would even, the assumption we made in ultra-locality was actually the assumption that things were asymptotically free. But if there's a Planck length in the regime, then that assumption clearly breaks down the moment you go to Planck length. So maybe it's true if you started computing gravitational corrections, then you may be right that you may also lose that, because even the fact that things are asymptotically free, the correlator has this 1 by x squared form, is not true if you start taking x to be Planck length size. So it's probably true then that you would lose that also if you started doing Planck length corrections. So that's the correct answer. I think what I said before is maybe not right. If you started doing gravitational corrections, which include L Planck, I think you would lose that. If you did other corrections, then you would preserve that further. Yeah, are there any other questions about this? So there are two simple messages which I want everyone to get. Okay,
So,
yeah.
sometime back we concluded that if some correlators are thermal, it
Yes.
does not imply that the state is thermal.
Correct.
If I want the state to be thermal,
Yes.
can I conclude something about the correlators?
The correlators are thermal. The correlators, that's easy. If you know the state is thermal, you know what the correlators are. From the correlators to the state is very hard to do, because the correlators look like they are very close to thermal for many other things. Unless you know the correlators exactly, all correlators exactly, you can't guess the state is thermal. If you knew all correlators absolutely exactly, of course you could. But we don't know that. Given the state, you can always compute the correlators. That's easy. Given the correlators, you can't compute the state. State has a lot more information than the correlators that you compute.
You have a large system.
That's right, you have a large system. That's why it's so hard. You give me a few correlators.
So, when you calculated the thermal phase, there was a diagonal part and
Right.
e to the power n. If we could have ever detected the Hawking radiation, we could have.
The Hawking radiation you can detect. I mean, there's no problem in detecting the Hawking radiation.
Initially, we
Well, oh, so you mean the CMB? Yeah. So there's a practical problem in it. Yeah. In everything we're doing, we're not talking about practical issues, but yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So that thermal detection we can always.
Right.
What I'm thinking, what the e to the power minus s by 2 will feel like when we detect the
The e to the minus s by 2 will not actually feel like anything, you see, because it's a very hard question. You're asking, what does a non-perturbative quantum gravity correction feel like? That's not a question that's well defined. When we talk about feel like, we're talking about a given background and saying that you're detecting, you're measuring some correlation functions. So the e to the minus s by 2 would be some e to the minus s correction to correlation function. But it's a very hard statement to say what it would feel like, because what do you even mean by defining the positions of operators at that point? When you say phi of x1, phi of x2, you can't even define the positions in some non-perturbative sense. So what do you mean by x1 and x2? Those positions in a full theory of quantum gravity are not well defined. So there isn't any, I don't know of any way to answer the question of what it would feel like. It's a non-perturbative correction. So what do non-perturbative quantum gravity corrections feel like? I mean, everything that we talk about feel like and observe and so on is based on the notion of perturbation theory. And quantum fields about curve space time. So we can talk about gravity waves because there are fluctuations about a background. You can even talk about corrections to them, interactions, gravity waves, scattering and so on. But you're talking about what non-perturbative corrections would feel like is beyond the realm of perturbation theory, so it's very, in gravity it's very hard to talk about.
So this e to the minus s by 2, this s is in Planck units.
S is in, it's a number, yeah.
So for, do we know what will be the number s for some, say, for the sun if the sun was...
Good tutorial question. Very good. So actually very good tutorial question. Good. So computers. Please do it. You know the formula for S, right? S is E by 4. So you have to restore factor the impedance for the sun. Also compute the lifetime using the Stephen Boltzmann. Please do it. It's very simple. Okay, so don't get scared. You just have to put in factors of H, C, and G. And even though we don't do practical things, it's useful to remember what these numbers are and put them in. And in whatever units you like, and compute the lifetime in years and the S for the sun. I mean, please try to do this. It's a simple question. I really like all of you to attempt it. Shouldn't take you more than 10 minutes each. S is A by 4, and the lifetime comes by looking at doing d, m by dt is minus A by 2. Okay, so we are almost at the end. Let me take 5 minutes more so we can do something good, so we can conclude tomorrow. So with your permission, can I take 5 minutes more and say something? Okay. So let me take 5 minutes more and start heading towards what is really a paradox. Okay, so how do you really start getting a paradox? To really start getting a paradox, you have to start with some computations that Page did. Okay. So this is not a paradox, but you can start looking at some work that Page did 1989. I think 1989 or 1991.
1980, right?
Huh?
The original Page paper, no?
This Page paper I'm talking about, which has to do with entropy of subsystems, I think maybe later.
Okay.
So 1980, maybe 1991. It's called the entropy of subsystems. It has some, search for Page entropy of subsystems. You see it. It may even be 91. Something around that time. Okay. Entropy of subsystems. I would say it's 1990 plus or minus 2. Okay, so now here, what was Page's argument? Okay, so it's a very simple argument. He said, take a black hole. Okay. If you do Google search, by the way, Google will fix the plus or minus 2. So, and take some region very far away. Okay. This is an imaginary boundary. This boundary I have. Let me do it in the scene. It's an imaginary boundary. It's a region where it's not a real boundary. Okay. So this is the black hole, and this is some imaginary boundary. And the region outside this boundary I call A, and the region inside the boundary I call A complement. Okay. So this is A, which is outside the boundary, and this is A complement. Okay. Page showed actually that we can look at the following quantity and make the following statement about this quantity, which I'm going to say. you see, if you can look at the density matrix of the system A, which is, you take the black hole state, let's say the full black hole and the whole universe is in some state psi, right? You can take the density matrix of the whole universe, which is a pure density matrix, and trace over A tilde, and trace over the complement of A. That is rho A. That's the definition of rho A, the density matrix of one part of the system. Then you can define SA is minus trace of rho A log rho A. And just for convenience, I'm going to subtract off an S naught, which is this quantity in the vacuum. Rho vacuum. Okay. This is trace of rho vacuum log of rho vacuum. Okay. So you see, if there was no black hole, even then this number SA actually will be non-zero. This is the statement I made yesterday, that even the vacuum has entanglement between different regions of space-time. So if you compute the entanglement of one region with another region, that's non-zero even in the vacuum. Okay. In the black hole, it's some other number which has to do with what the state of the full universe is, which has some energy. But you can take this and subtract it off. For the vacuum, this would be zero. For some other state, it's something that depends on the state. Okay. Then, what have we said so far? You see, if you take, this is a function of t. Okay. So, what are the statements that we have made so far about the purity, of Hawking radiation? We have made the following statements. Look at SA and look at time. Okay. What is SA at time 0? What is SA at time 0? SA time 0 is actually 0 because you subtracted off S0. So SA at time 0 is exactly 0. Right? Because it's minus, because at time 0 there's nothing inside A, right? This is the region A, and region A is like the vacuum. It's very far from the black hole. Okay, so at time 0, which is when the black hole is formed, it looks like there's nothing there, so it looks like the vacuum. So it's reasonable to expect that SA is 0. Right? Then the B radiation starts coming there, right? Slowly. The radiation starts coming there. Some energy starts coming into the region after a long time. So you know that SA goes up. Okay, what happens after a very long time? Right, but what happens after a very long time? Actually something else happens. It goes back to 0. Because you see, after a very long time, all the radiation, all the energy is in A. Right? All the energy has gone into A. So, SA has gone back to being 0 if it's a pure state. You see, if it's a pure state, okay, then SA has gone back to being 0. I mean, maybe it goes at F0. Let's forget about S0. If it is a constant, let's forget about S. Otherwise, we'll have to deal with the constant here. Let me just set this to 0. Okay? Just to avoid complication. So now, this number is non-zero if it's is 0 if it's a pure state. For pure states, trace of rho log rho is 0. You can check. And for impure states, it's not 0. If the full state is pure, then SA is 0 because SA is now in a pure state. So at the end also it's 0.
At t equals 0, the black hole is there, or? The
black hole is there, but there's no energy in SA. At t equals infinity, or as you go to infinity or very large times, all the energy is in SA.
So black hole is just formed
at t equals 0. The black hole is just formed at t equals 0. At this large time, this is t lifetime. Okay, t life. Plus whatever time it takes for radiation to get there, the black hole is fully evaporated. It's 0 again, right? Page showed that in fact, so this is what we said so far. It's 0, which is obvious from in the beginning. It's a vacuum. In the end, it's 0 because it's pure again. So if we believe that unitary evolution holds and quantum evolution holds, we said it's 0 here and 0 here, and there's no contradiction in that.
And it's not pure because it has also taken the black hole inside.
It's taken the black hole, but you see, you had a pure state, it went back to a pure state. You started the black hole in a pure state, it evaporated, it gave rise to radiation, and the radiation is also in a pure state, because it's unitary evolution. So even though the black hole is in radiation, it's still in a pure state.
Basically, partial trace doesn't affect it anymore.
That's right. So now this A doesn't have any, there's no energy anymore, which is, in the end, you should in the beginning A is 0, so it has nothing in it. In the end, A is the full system. A has all the energy of the system. So now, A is again pure because the full system is again the pure state. So in the beginning, A has, it's like saying you have two parts of the system. Okay. First A is nothing, and then A, after some time, A is the full system. So it's like imagining, what you should imagine this is that you have a box, and you divide into two parts, okay, and there's a partition. This is A and A complement. When the partition is here, the entropy of A is 0. When the partition is there, the entropy of A is again 0 because now it's the full system. Okay? So at the end also it's 0. In fact, Page showed by a consideration precisely of such partitions, okay, that a generic, I won't prove this for you, but I'm stating the result. For a generic state, you can say much more than saying that it's 0 here and 0 here. In fact, you can say it goes up and comes down. It goes up monotonically and comes down monotonically. Okay? And this point where it comes down is called the Page time. Okay, so this is the result. It comes precisely from considering, subsystems, a big system, and partitioning it into two parts, and considering, what happens as you move the partition from one end to the other end. And you can show that for generic states, this is a very robust result. In fact, this result also holds up to e to the minus s by 2. This straight line is a bit of a fake. I have to rescale time for that. So there's a curve you get, and the important part here is it increases monotonically and decreases monotonically. And this point where it decreases, starts decreasing, is called the Page time. It's roughly when the entropy of the black hole has become half of what it was initially. This Page time. Okay, so this is what I want to say. Now, let me just one thing and then I'll stop. You see, now the job that we have, so far what we had to say, all we had to say to resolve the paradox was you check it 0 here and you check it 0 here. Check it 0 here in the beginning is obvious, there's nothing there. And now in the end we said was, the calculation is not precise enough to say that it's non-zero. So we might just as well say it's 0. No one can do a calculation to check whether SA is non-zero or 0. So, if from quantum mechanics tells us it should be 0, so we are happy with the fact it should be 0. There's no balance, right? But now Page said that actually it's not good enough to check that it's 0 in the beginning and 0 at the end. In fact, you should check this full curve. Okay, so you have to check a curve, and that we'll see tomorrow will lead to a more robust paradox. Okay, so the important new element, I'm just going to summarize and then I'll stop. So far, we said in the beginning that Hawking radiation suggests that you have a black hole here. The black hole radiates thermally out into the region A. So initially, people thought that meant that this entropy starts from 0 and keeps going up. Okay? So at the end, the entropy has gone up because A is getting more and more energy density. So as you compute its entropy, it goes up again. And if that was true, that would be a violation of fundamental principle of quantum mechanics, which is that pure states have to evolve into pure states. Okay? But we showed that that calculation was based on a mistaken assumption of computing low point correlators and using that to infer something about the density matrix, which was wrong. Okay. And therefore, it's perfectly consistent to say that the entropy at infinity or at very late times is 0, which is what we expect. But now we want to make the paradox more precise. And the first step to making the paradox more precise is this Page curve, which tells you that the entropy goes up, and at about half the lifetime, it then has to start going down monotonically again to 0. So we've got some more details about how the entropy has to behave. We've added one more assumption. The assumption we've added is that the black hole is in a generic state. So initially the only assumption was quantum mechanics holds. To get this assumption, to get this curve, you also need the assumption that the black hole is in a generic state. Okay. So tomorrow we'll see how this leads to what I call the modern information paradox.